Welcome back to She Rises Daily, Emerging You in 10. I'm your host, Doc Shelley, here to bring you your daily dose of inspiration, empowerment, and growth. We talk a lot about comparison. Stop comparing yourself to people on social media. Stop comparing your career to someone else's. Stop comparing your chapter 3 to someone else's chapter 20. You've heard all of that. And there's another kind of comparison I don't think we talk about nearly enough. Comparing yourself to yourself. I used to be so much more productive. I used to work out all the time. I used to have so much energy. I used to be able to handle this. I used to be more creative. And before long, the person you used to be becomes the standard the person you are today keeps failing to meet. So here's my question. Why are we assuming that an earlier version of you is automatically the best benchmark for the life you're living now? Because maybe you haven't fallen behind. Maybe the conditions changed. Maybe your priorities changed. Perhaps you changed. And maybe today's version of you deserves to be understood on today's terms. Your past performance came with past conditions. We have a tendency to remember what we accomplished without remembering what surrounded it. Maybe you were incredibly productive during one season, but you also had fewer responsibilities, different support, different demands, different relationships, different energy. Maybe you exercised 6 days a week. Great. But what did the rest of your life look like then? Maybe you traveled constantly and loved it. Maybe you worked 12-hour days and barely noticed. Maybe you could manage 20 different commitments without feeling overwhelmed. But you aren't a controlled experiment. The variables changed. You cannot fairly compare outputs while ignoring conditions. That's true in business, it's true in research, and it is certainly true in a human life. Before you decide you are somehow doing worse than you used to, ask yourself what else has changed. You may discover you're comparing two versions of yourself who were playing on completely different fields. Capacity changes, and that's not automatically decline. This is where we can become unnecessarily hard on ourselves. We interpret change capacity as diminished capability. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Your capacity is affected by what is happening in your life, by what you are carrying, by what you are prioritizing, by what you are recovering from, by what you are building, where you are investing your energy. You may have exactly the same capability you had 5 years ago, and much less capacity available for that particular thing. Or maybe you genuinely don't want to operate at your previous capacity anymore. That's allowed too, because sometimes what we call, I can't do what I used to do, it's actually, I'm no longer willing to pay what that version of my life cost me. That's not decline. That might be wisdom. I've heard some version of this countless times in coaching. I don't know what's wrong with me. I used to be able to handle all of this. And I so often want to stop right there at those words, all of this. Because this isn't what you were handling then. Maybe there are more people depending on you now. Maybe your role has changed. Maybe you're leading at a different level. Maybe you're navigating things personally that were not present before. Maybe what matters to you has changed. Or maybe you've simply learned that constantly operating at maximum capacity isn't how you want to live your life anymore. So instead of asking, why can't I be who I used to be? I think there's a much more useful question. What does this version of me need to thrive in this version of my life? Now, we're not trying to recreate the past. We're responding to the present. Honor what your former self gave you without making them your boss. I love looking back at earlier versions of ourselves with appreciation. They got us here. They learned things. They survived things. They built things. They made mistakes we now know how not to make. Your former self deserves some gratitude. They don't need to run your current life, though, because they didn't know what you know now. They didn't have today's responsibilities. They didn't have today's relationships or today's values or today's priorities, and they certainly weren't building today's life. Your past self can be part of your story without becoming the standard you have to keep reproducing. Honor them, learn from them, and then let today's version of you decide what happens next. Progress doesn't always look like more. This may be the piece I want us to remember most. We have been conditioned to recognize progress as expansion, more productivity, more responsibility, more achievement, more output, more capacity. And sometimes progress looks like less, fewer commitments, stronger boundaries, more rest, greater focus, more intentional choices, doing 3 things extraordinarily well instead of 12 things while quietly losing your mind. Maybe the goal isn't to prove you can still do everything your younger self could. Maybe the goal is to become more discerning about what deserves you now. That is progress too. Here's your reflection question for today. Where have you been using a previous version of yourself as evidence that the current version of you isn't doing enough? And what changes when you include the conditions, not just the output, in that comparison? Here's your power thought. You don't owe your past self a reenactment. You owe your present self an honest response to the life you're living now. Your previous self isn't the enemy, and you don't need to diminish who you were to honor who you are. Celebrate what that version of you accomplished. Be grateful for what they built. Carry forward what still serves you. And stop assuming that growth requires you to reproduce their life. You have different information now, different priorities, different conditions, perhaps different dreams. The question isn't, can I still be who I used to be? The question is, who does this life I'm living now invite me to become? That's a much more interesting question. This week, catch yourself the next time you say, I used to, and finish the thought, but don't stop there. Add, and what was different then? Give yourself the whole comparison, not just the part that makes current you look inadequate. Then ask what you need now. Thank you for joining me for another episode of She Rises Daily, Emerging You in 10. If today's conversation made you think of someone who's been getting their ass kicked in an imaginary competition with their former self, perhaps lovingly send this episode their way. And until next time, remember, who you were got you here. Be grateful for them. And you don't have to keep recreating them. Build for the life you're living now.